Hoje eu tô querendo muita putaria. Eu vou pro bailão, atrás da danadinha. Eu vou pro bailão, atrás das danadinha. Pra levar pra tentar e socar na bucetinha. Pra levar pra tentar e socar na bucetinha. Hoje eu tô querendo muita putaria. Eu vou pro bailão, atrás das danadinha. Eu vou pro bailão, atrás das danadinha. Pra levar pra tentar e socar na bucetinha. Pra levar pra tentar e socar na bucetinha. Hoje é mandelinha de quebrinha. Vou fumar um canque e tomar uma garrafinha.
Passa, sarra, roça, esfrega, dança. Bum, 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 bum. Passa, sarra, roça, esfrega, dança, 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 dança. Bum, 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 bum. Passa, sarra, roça, esfrega, dança, 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 dança. Bum, 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 bum.
E aí?
Eu tô no baile, olha o que ela faz pra geral. E quando encosto no baile, olha o que ela faz pra geral. Ela passa, sarra, roça, esfrega, dança, quica. Ela bate com a bunda no pau. Então vai, passa, sarra, roça, esfrega, dança, quica. Ela bate com a bunda no pau.
Vai com a bunda no chão, estremece. Vai com a bunda no chão, estremece. Piriguete, quem elas são? Quem elas são? As piranha da 17. Quem elas são? As piranha da 17. Tá ligado, né, porra? Quem elas são? Piriguete.
Aê, porra! DJ menor pega! Chama, filho!
How is cancer of the prostate diagnosed? How is
Hi,
anemia
everybody.
diagnosed? How is kidney
Glad
failure
you
diagnosed?
all liked that song. That is Brazilian Funk Mix 2019. Thanks for coming to class. Whew, it is so warm in this room right now, but we are here and we are gonna have class. So glad some of you are feeling like a 5 right now. Where am I? I don't know. I'm like an 8, like not terrible. I was the one who did the drop, so let's see. Yeah.
I just got a cat.
If you click in that one, you should be able to find somewhere in the information which songs are being remixed.
I just got a nice cat.
You got a nice cat? That's great. I have the two here, but I think they're sleeping. So, just a reminder that as was decided a few weeks ago, we're going to record the class unless and until there are major objections about it. So do go, if you haven't yet clicked your consent in the Microsoft form I put up, do go and consent to that. So I'm also, because last week was a writing workshop and not content, normally I will only leave the recordings up for 1 week so that people don't get too behind. But I would be willing, because it was focused on skills in writing, to leave it up for longer. So I have 2 cats. One I got from a friend and one I got from the SPCA in Edmonton. So my question for you guys is, do you want the writing workshop to be available to you all semester? Yes. I'm thinking that most people will say yes. Well, you don't have to go check it out, but it's available if you want to. Okay. So I will leave the writing workshop up, and we will be having another one later in the semester. Okay, no animal cruelty in my classroom, please. So today we are, oh, the sun is so annoying. Today we are talking about a new worldview in terms of how one views madness, mental illness, or psychological distress. And what we're going to look at this week and next week is commonly called anti-psychiatry. And anti-psychiatry, in the sense we're going to talk about it in this class, really came together as a movement in the 1960s and the 1970s in both the US and continental Europe. So we're going to take a look at this as a strikingly different worldview from both the psychoanalytic paradigm we looked at and as well from some of the medieval views. So yes, no threats in chat, please. Let's see what we can do today. I made you guys this little chart because this is one of the things that you should be thinking about. So our final essay is going to be a comparative essay between at least two of the worldviews that we consider. And you can see I made this very simple chart. What is the problem considered to be in madness? So like, what is the issue or the cause? What are the exemplary diagnoses, or what names does the viewpoint use for different conditions? And what are the proposed cures, right? What is the treatment plan that is thought to alleviate this suffering? So I'll probably bring this back after the next unit as well, and we'll add on to this during the semester. Let's just review. Okay, so one more person drifting in. So today's outline, we're going to talk about the rise of the medical model of mental illness prior to the anti-psychiatric movement. So we're not gonna spend as much time on the first medical model, but it's important to know what anti-psychiatrists were reacting to. We're going to talk about the different varieties of what can be called anti-psychiatry. And today we're going to focus in on one important figure whose name is Thomas Szasz. And I always spell his name wrong. I always forget the second S. So that's there. Yes, we are recording the class, Arlette. So then we're going to look at what Szasz specifically says about the myth of mental illness, which is the title of a piece that you have to read for next time. So he wrote this in 1961. We're going to read that. We're going to look at why he thinks mental illness in those terms is a myth, how he reframes the problem of suffering, which he calls problems of living, and the issues that he takes with psychiatry as a form of social control. So next week, we're going to talk about what the treatment plan or what the alternatives look like under psychiatry or under anti-psychiatry. And today we're sort of laying some of the foundations. Good. Okay, so I briefly mentioned at some point that psychoanalysis was one of the dominant therapeutic modes up until the 1950s. In the 1950s and 60s, what we saw rising was discussion of psychology, suffering, mental illness in terms of cognition and behavior. So this is when things like cognitive behavioral therapy came about, which work on organizing our thoughts and training our actions. And another rising model, which is strictly physiological, medical, and neurological model of mental illness. So sometimes people will refer to this as the chemical imbalance theory, which is the idea that although we don't know exactly what, one day we could, in principle, discover exactly what the chemical imbalances are for different sorts of illnesses and treat them as brain diseases. So this is behind some of the thinking, but not all of the thinking around psychopharmacology as well. And within this model, mental illness is analogous to physical illness. So in the same way that if you're diabetic, this is a common one people use, right? If you're diabetic, you need to take insulin. So that is a physical issue in your body and a treatment for it. If you are, say, depressed, then you need to take antidepressants. So they're operating on the same logic. And it's also at this time that pharmacology started using antipsychotics, particularly of the heavily sedative kind. So antipsychotics such as Haldol, right? Which really like weigh the person down and often leave them in kind of a zombified state, right? Which really like they sedate them hardcore. So this is as a little bit of background that antipsychiatry came about as psychoanalysis was waning and this medical model was increasing. Oh my God. This is scary, but don't get scared. So this is one quote from the Saz piece that we're going to read this week. The ones in blue are italicized in his original paper. So what he does is, before he goes into his view of why mental illness is a myth, in his terms, he talks about this very medical view, right? So he says there's one school of thought where the assumption is made that some neurological defect, right, that we will find a physical cause, even if it's very small, even if it's very subtle, for all disorders of thinking and behavior. And Saz is not only is skeptical of this, but he actually thinks that this implies that differences in personal needs, opinions, values, in social or cultural raising will not actually be eliminated, right? So we can't say that all of the problems of living are actually problems that are in the brain, so to speak. Because this is a kind of fantasy wherein if the problem is only mental illness, and if mental illness is really under it all just physiological, then we just won't have these kinds of distress, right? So this is also a kind of viewpoint, the medical model, which is not necessarily as compatible with understandings of trauma, except for some neurologists today who will also try to measure trauma in the brain, right? But Saz is saying, it seems like we can't, and it seems like this implies that the biggest trouble we need to fix is in people's heads, so to speak. Yeah, let me know if I'm going too fast, or if my internet is freaking out again. I really wish Okay, I don't wish we were having class in person because COVID is still rampant. But if we were having class in person, I would take everybody out to a field right now, and that would be lovely. So anti-psychiatry was a kind of movement, as I mentioned, across the US, Canada, continental Europe, the UK, and clustered within this movement, there are views ranging from those who still practice as psychiatrists, those who still accept psychiatric treatment, those who don't promote psychiatric treatment but do promote therapy, those who do not engage with the medical, psychiatric or psychological system at all. So we're going to look at Saz more in depth, and Saz himself remained a practicing psychiatrist while being very critical of its form. But what's common among anti-psychiatric views that we'll be looking at is the critique of mainstream psychiatry as controlling, repressive, and inhumane. So a number of you in the last assignment, right, already were picking up on potential critique of this kind in discussions of the asylums and the places of confinement, right? So we can see this as given that asylums and psychiatric hospitals continued, this is a part of that same story. Yeah. And there are some general things that we can say anti-psychiatrists weighed more heavily. So first is they appreciated human variation, the variations in our behavior, emotion, and expression that come from so-called mental illness over conformity, over the idea that we, sorry?
What do you mean by voluntary?
Voluntary in the second line. So well, it's the opposite of involuntary, but like I volunteer, right? I'm making a choice to enter into a certain kind of psychiatric care versus someone else, right? Saying this person is sick, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if something's voluntary, right, it's something you're choosing of your own person, whoops. Whereas involuntary psychiatric commitment, which still occurs to this day, normally involves, right, someone else saying, okay, this person is not properly well, they can't choose for themselves. So generally, anti-psychiatrists are very opposed to involuntary commitment, right? There's very few conditions that they would accept. It's actually necessary to place someone in a restrictive asylum. Good. They tend to argue that medical problems, strictly medical problems, right? Like if I have a liver disease, should be separated and treated differently from social and moral problems. So instead of the institutions of medicine and psychiatry being intertwined as they are now, right? To become a psychiatrist, you have to become a medical doctor. Most anti-psychiatrists will argue that these should be two separate parts of society, that they shouldn't be working together. Yeah. They generally speak in terms of human behavior and human expression rather than in terms of diagnoses. So we'll get to what Saz calls the problems of living. And this is his general term, right, that he applies to these so-called mentally ill patients. So he speaks in terms of what people do and say rather than nailing them down to a specific label. The anti-psychiatrists generally tend to promote freedom and liberty over authoritarian decisions. So the idea being that If we have our freedom first, then we'll be able to make the changes that will help us with our problems in living, rather than thinking, okay, we can only make changes to a state of being sick by taking away one's freedom. Cats and frogs are both cool. I have that to say. So this is generally what holds together what we call anti-psychiatry. Is it really that time? Yeah. So we're going to look specifically at this guy whose name I already mentioned. His name is Thomas Szasz. He died just a few years ago. And he's a Hungarian American whose family came to the United States just before World War II. So he went to medical school. He did his adult growing up in Connecticut, I believe. And after medical school, so he went to medical school, became a psychiatrist, and he worked at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis for 5 years. So it's after this point, after 1956, when he starts writing and critiquing psychiatry strongly. So first he publishes the short paper we're reading, and then he expands it into an entire book. So as I said, he maintained his psychiatric practice while at the same time strongly critiquing many of its dominant uses. So he was also critical of the use of psychiatrists in courtrooms, right? The use of psychiatrists as experts regarding crime. He thought that that as well is actually a social problem masquerading as a medical problem. So Szasz thinks that already, right, this is 1961, the language of mental illness had caught on, and he noted that something's squeaking in the window. He noted that we use the term mentally ill all the time without being clear what we mean about it, right? Without it being clear that we actually share the same definitions, the same theories, and the same meanings. So what he opens his essay with, and you'll see this week, is he says, instead of using this concept and trying to clarify it, let's just say, what do we mean, right? When we say someone is mentally ill, what are we referring to? Are we referring to a part of their body? Are we referring to a label they got from a psychiatrist? Or are we referring to something in their behavior or expression? Okay, so maybe, hopefully not everybody will change your name to Maya. But we're going to keep looking. See there, I misspelled his name on this one. We're going to keep looking at Szasz's arguments, right? And I think it's ones that we should take seriously. Even if you could say anti-psychiatry didn't quote unquote win, we use the term mental illness today, but that still doesn't mean that it is an objective fact out there. Oh, yeah. Let's see. 1 minute in the chat. There's a lot of Mayas now. Okay, so I did want to give us, this feels like I went through it quickly. Hopefully it makes sense to some of y'all. I was going to put in our 5-minute break here. Can I get out of this? So that it's early enough. Find a 5-minute break. Yeah. All right, so let's get back into the anti-psychiatry vibe. That was kind of a fun countdown. I've never used that one before. There we go. Okay. So, as always, please tell me if there's any questions, clarifications, problems as we go along. So what I'm doing in this class is I'm basically, I'm giving you the skeleton or the map to be able to read the SAS piece for homework clearly and know where the landmarks are. So hopefully this is helpful, and this kind of will help you think about how papers are organized as you read them. So remember, SAS said, there's this viewpoint rising that says every mental illness is just a potential brain disease, that we haven't discovered the technicalities of it yet. So SAS thinks that there's two main errors with this model, right? The first is that it views mental distress as analogous with physical illness, just as I was saying, that it goes from a symptom to an assumed lesion or wound, right? An assumed physical cause. You might remember, right? This kind of model is already challenged by things like psychosomatic illness, which don't have a lesion, wound, or physical cause in that way. And the second error that SAS thinks happens within this viewpoint is that it collapses mental symptoms with what are actually ethical judgments, right? So if I say that someone is acting unstable, right, that instability is a symptom, he's saying, well, why is unstable inherently bad? Right? If what you're really saying is just that they change a lot, that seems to be a part of their behavior. So he really thinks that in ascribing symptoms to mental illness, right, we might say something like emotional dysregulation, we might say something like reacting to hallucinations. He thinks we're actually making judgments about people. Let's see. Well, we'll see, because maybe Maya will get a lot of participation grades for today if everybody's Maya. We should think about that. So SAS says we speak about mental symptoms, right? When we say that someone has showing signs of mental illness, we're usually referring to how they speak about themselves, how they speak about others, how they behave around themselves and others, right? So the statement that X is a mental symptom, right? So say I was kind of shaking. If you interpret that as a mental symptom, you're already making a judgment about me, right? You're making a decision, and SAS would say it has something to do with the fact that we don't like people shaking all the time in public. I think about this a lot, about the very fact that it's not acceptable, except for like a few strands of society, to yell in public, right? We view yelling in public as something that's bad behavior, as something that might be dangerous. Yeah, so one of the Mayas has said, right, on SAS's view, what we call mental illness is people acting abnormally, right? People breaking the unwritten social rules of society. So, let me see. Yes, we're gonna watch a little video. Oh, one more thing in the chat. Yeah. So part of what SAS would say, right, is, are people who are homeless necessarily mentally ill? Might some of them instead have adapted to their situation, right? They've tried to find certain kinds of strategies for what he would say is a problem in living, right? So if Saz was going to say, take an approach, he would probably say, give the homeless people a house before you give them psychiatric medication, right? So treat the social issue, treat the problem in living, before you attempt to find any kind of brain disease. Yeah. Good examples. So I'm going to play this short video. This is Saz when he's quite a bit older. Yeah, get out of here. There we go. Exactly, right? We can also say that drug use comes from often certain kinds of social conditions, right? What are the options? What are the coping possibilities? It's not necessarily, right, that there's actually some chemical imbalance in their brains. So we're just going to watch a couple minutes of this, this old man, Thomas Saz, and then we'll come back to it.
How is cancer of the prostate diagnosed? How is anemia diagnosed? How is kidney failure diagnosed? How is a stroke diagnosed? By objective tests relying on chemistry and physics, on the basic sciences, right?
Right.
How is schizophrenia and depression diagnosed?
By external behavior.
Behavior,
Right.
complaints,
Right.
words that one person says to another person.
Right.
Now, as soon as schizophrenia and depression and post-traumatic neurosis and all these specific diseases and homosexuality, because that also used to be a mental illness, and masturbation and escaped slaves, of course we don't have that anymore. As soon as all these mental diseases are diagnosed by objective chemical and physical tests first,
Before autopsy.
before the person utters a word. If an ordinary person now makes an appointment with an internist, with a general physician, routinely, before he sees a physician, the system, the medical system that this physician is working in, will set up a laboratory appointment with him, and he will have a panel of all kinds of chemical and hematological tests, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe an X-ray of the chest, 2 or 3 weeks before he ever sees the physician. And then he may have an EKG, he may have some other tests. Now what is a physician looking for? He's not talking to the person.
Right.
He doesn't make a diagnosis from the fact that I don't feel well, I'm tired, I'm cold, I'm hot, although those clues help. That's not the basis for his diagnosis. The basis for a diagnosis is an objective test. This is not the case in psychiatry.
All right, so that's a little bit of what Saz thinks, right? We have this analogy where he says, if you go and you're getting diagnosed for cancer, they'll do all kinds of tests, but they won't necessarily interview you, right? Talk to you, listen to your communication in the same way that they diagnose a mental illness. So I can see the chat is getting heated. Let's try not to be dismissive of neither teenagers nor the homeless, as I believe some of you are still teenagers, and we never know who is among us. So please, if we can keep the chat respectful, exactly. So, and on topic, right? What happens if you I think you mean prescribed, right? So if you're prescribed antidepressants and you're just sad and not depressed, there's a number of things that might happen. You might have some strange side effects. It's possible you would enter into a mania. But it's also the fact that antidepressants really, they do interact with everybody differently, even among bodies that do have clinically diagnosed depression. So it's a bit harder to answer. Yeah, and so one of the things, right, is that, so one of the Mayas is saying, I was diagnosed with one thing and offered another. So maybe one of the points towards Saz's point is because that our diagnoses change, right? They fluctuate. Sometimes the treatments for very different diagnoses are similar, right? So it's not as if a diagnosis is this like, let me see. A diagnosis is not like a species of plant or a species of animal, right? That we would go out and find in the world. A diagnosis is something we create. And in psychiatry, we create it with a list of symptoms, right? Yeah, exactly. So after we do the anti-psychiatry unit, we're gonna go more in depth into the medical model, into diagnoses, and into the DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So let's see a few more things out of Saz. So I've mentioned a few times already that Saz uses this language of problems in living, right? He doesn't say people have mental illness. He says they have different kinds of problems in living. And he thinks, in fact, we should remove diagnoses and we should see how, well, he says a few things, right? He says, living isn't easy. All of us, he uses the word man, right? All of us have the problem, the question of how we should live and why, of what choices we can make and how. And actually, right, when we're looking at someone's behavior, it's coming from part of their project of finding a way to live, right? Finding a way to live that is fulfilling, that is surviving, and maybe also thriving. Yeah, and there's different problems of living, right? So some of them, as I said, right, one of the problems in living might be homelessness. It might require building houses, right? Some of the problems in living might have to do with the norms of society, with what's acceptable and not, right? So lots of people rock, and if you see someone rocking in public, it's often not accepted, right? This person is often stared at, looked at strangely, when that might just be the way they move. So there's lots of things, right, that Saz thinks if we just say it all has to do with something in the brain, we're actually missing out on it, and we're not going to make people's lives better.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
It's about all of these like diagnoses and all of that. Like if you actually just, for example, if you tell yourself that you're not going to be, I understand there's factors and whatever, but if you have a mindset that you're not going to let these things like distract you and make you sad and bring you down, wouldn't that like take away the anxiety? Wouldn't that take away the stress, or not even? Because I mean,
what do you mean by these things?
Like, for example, somebody who's stressed, right? They're stressed because they keep thinking about their situation. But if you try to find solutions to get out of your situation, you're not going to be stressed anymore. Or I don't know how it works.
Yeah. So I like to go back to a distinction. Well, it's articulated by a lot of people, but one of the people who articulate it is actually Buddhist scholars, and they make a difference between pain and suffering. So that there's some level at which, right? I can't, I don't know, if I go down the stairs outside my house and somebody like rides a bike straight into me, that is going to distress me, right? That is going to stress me out. It's possible that I could stress myself out extra by thinking about it and ruminating on it. But even if I don't, it may be stressful, right? So that there's a kind of base level of experience at which unpleasantness, harm, or pain happens. And then there's kind of another level over it, right? Which is how we deal with it. Let me see what people are saying in chat because it's blowing up. For some, yeah, so for some it definitely works. Some people find it really helpful. Some people use things like affirmations, right? Some people actually will, well, I thought of something from my therapist and then I forgot it. Let's see. Yeah, some people will try and focus on other things, right? So they'll focus on something like if you have a ton of worry about the future, right? You might be legitimately worried. It's COVID-19. So we're not going to say necessarily that you can think yourself out of it, but you can avoid ruminating, right? You can avoid buckling down on it all. Not sure what the 5 cents is, but that's interesting. Yeah, so some people do that. Yes, exactly. The grounding techniques, like 5 things. This is a great simple grounding technique. It's like, name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can touch, and 1 thing you can taste. Exactly. So that, right, all of these are kind of ways that people have of dealing with the initial distress while trying not to compound it. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, and it is a question, right? And some people find it really hard in the moment. If you see yourself spinning and you're like, oh, I'm going to keep spinning, the question is how, right? The question is how not to increase one's distress. Yeah, good questions, everybody. I'm so glad. So problems in living, right? They still refer to real feeling bad, to real distress, to real discomfort. He's not saying that it's all in these people's cool. Hi, Maya QQ. He's not saying that it's all in people's heads, right? That it's made up or that it's pretend, right? But he's just saying it's not mental illness in this way. It is undesirable thoughts, feelings, or reactions, right? The behaviors. And it is compounded by the reactions of others, right? By the way that they behave or by the feelings that they express. So if somebody's shaking from anxiety and other people, right, are reacting by avoiding them, this may compound, right, their feeling of anxiety, and this may compound the very problems, right? Like if they need to go to a bank and everybody's avoiding them, how do they get service at the bank? Really practical things. And in these situations, right, he says that usually, especially when we see strangers, right, we don't like walk up and ask them like, hey, what's your diagnosis? What's going on? We make an assumption, we make an inference based on the ways in which they're behaving and acting. Let's see. Oh, I'm so tired, you guys, but we'll see. Hopefully we don't, well, if we finish class in an hour, we finish class in an hour. But hopefully we don't finish too early. I was trying to find an appropriate breakout room activity, but I feel like we need to get some more kind of like foundations and standards in this. And then next week we'll be able to have more discussion, right? So towards the end of the piece, which you'll read this week, Saz says that the very idea of mental illness, right? And this fantasy that if all problems in living are actually brain diseases, this fantasy that we could solve them all, but then we would be happy. This is a fantasy that covers over the fact that life for most people is the struggle, right? It's a struggle literally for survival for some, but also for kind of a good life, right? For attaining our values. So that it's not that, right? Once we figure out all the correct kinds of medications and treatments, everyone will be happy and fine all the time. Saz is saying no. Yeah, so if you have a sensitive question, you can maybe DM it to me directly, and I'll take a look and see. The Popeyes, yeah, it's not so much. So Saz is saying that what we do is we kind of ignore the social effects of health, right? We ignore all these other things that just come from the fact that we're human. We make choices, we have personal responsibility, and with those come in living. So he's not saying that we shouldn't treat and help people, right? But he's saying that it's not a mental illness, right? And that even as we treat people, it will not be this perfect, happy world. It's not just a matter of we investigate all the mental illnesses in a lab, we figure out which chemicals and transmitters we need, and then, right, we just give everybody a pill. So Saz says that's not going to happen. That's not how mental illness is working. It's working as more of a metaphor. Okay, hopefully whichever Maya has that question, you can send it to me if you'd like. You can also send it to me in a Mayo. And that goes for anybody the other time. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Maya's asking a question. I'm going to rephrase it more generally, but about how homosexuality used to be considered a mental illness. Now it's actually not included in the DSM, but it was up until the 1970s, right? And so she's talking about how some people still say that mental illness, but that it's become trendy, right? I guess one of the things that we could say to that, yeah. Okay, so this person sounds kind of like they're an evolutionary psychiatrist. I could send you some things that debunk this idea of nature, right? But I think overall, Saz would say, well, is homosexuality, right? Homosexuality itself is not a mental illness in that we can find it in the brain somewhere. Despite some people who will say that they're looking for a gay gene and they want to find a gay gene. I think that's very scary, right? But actually, right, what this person is responding to is really a kind of behavior and expression. I was teaching about homophobia and what goes on. Yeah, but why do we need to be born with it? Homophobia and what goes on in homophobic charges a couple of weeks ago. And right, one of the things that popped up is this idea, people often say like, hate the sinner, love the sin, or no, love the sinner, hate the sin. In that situation, right, it seems that what they're saying is, yeah, it's not the person, right? It's not in them. It's actually about their behavior. So you'll see, right? And this goes to the idea that if, right, someone is gay and they go to like a conversion camp, right, and they just don't behave, right? If they don't behave in homosexual sex, they're often, not always, but often the family takes that easier, right? Often the family will say, well, at least they're not practicing. And that suggests that there's something about the action, right? There's something about the behavior. The other thing you asked, you mentioned, right? Sometimes people will use the appeal of it's not natural. There's a lot of things we do that are not natural. There's a lot of things that are natural in the world that we don't do and that we don't want to do. So I would start on one of those two. But certainly, right, even though something like homosexuality has been removed as a medical psychiatric diagnosis for 50 years now, there's still people, right, who view it as an illness in some way. So thanks for bringing up this example, Maya. Right, and it actually leads kind of well into this, right? So one of the things Saz asks is, if illness is always in relation to health, right? So if you're sick, it's because there's some prior state in which you could have been healthy and you've diverged from it, right? So there's some idea of what normal health is. And he says, right, if we can say that, let's take the diabetes example, right? In diabetes, what's going on is the normal functioning of insulin production is interrupted, right? So what's happened is that that's being produced differently. He says, okay, what is the normal state that mental illness is attached to, or that mental illness is referring to? It's not actually, when we think of someone, right, without mental illness, we're not thinking about their brain or their chemicals. We're probably thinking about the way they're behaving, right? We're thinking about fitting into social norms, about these very ways in which we have trained our bodies, our expressions, our behaviors to be respectable. So this is a norm, he says, right? That is actually psychosocial, it's ethical, sometimes it's legal, but what we're doing is we're trying to give it a medical solution. So he says, if there's mental illness, what is mental health? Mental health is a type of behavior, right? So this is very different from, so he actually thinks that, and he's referring to legal in that he thinks there's a certain association made between how a good citizen should be versus how a criminal should be, and that's related to the behavior of problems of living, right? So sometimes in problems of living, crime and distress get lumped together. Hopefully that makes sense. We're gonna have so we're gonna have this paper to read this week, and instead of a quiz, I've got a questionnaire where I just ask you to put in one quote from Saz that you found compelling or interesting or you understood, and put in one quote that was confusing, clear, didn't make sense. So hopefully with this little framework to go into the paper, and those we can get it all clear. Phew. It's so warm in here. More water. Okay. So one of the things that Saz and others, oh, I'm sorry, it's freezing, pinpoint about psychiatry, right, is psychiatry as a form of social control, right? So he thinks what's effectively going on, right, is it's a medicalized, so it's under the guise of medicine. It is a way to encourage behavioral conformity, right, to erase human differences, and to control individuals who don't seem to be acting as we desire. So in place of social control, anti-psychiatric activists often challenge this conformity, right? And they encourage behavioral and social differences. So rather than having one idea of human movement, having many, for example. Typically, right, as I said earlier, they object strongly to involuntary detention and involuntary use of drugs, as well as treatments like electroshock therapy. So instead of performing this kind of social control, we ought instead to accept so-called abnormal behaviors, and as I said earlier, focus on fixing the social problems. So whether the social problems be poverty, homelessness, kinds of conflict, lacks of freedom for the people, we ought to do all this and loosen our social control. So this is part of what Saz is saying to psychiatry from within psychiatry. Let's see, what's that? Oh yeah, okay. One more thing. So Saz also, right, makes a particular charge against psychiatry in that he thinks other kinds of medicine or other kinds of science can sometimes be objective, right? So he spoke about the scan for cancer, right? He thinks that's a fairly objective, value-free kind of thing to do a scan. So maybe I discriminate from people who are applying to get the scans, right? Or maybe I interpret it poorly on the other end. But the scan itself doesn't contain, right, any of my ethical views and judgments, right? So he thinks that psychiatry is claiming that it can be just as objective as other forms of medicine and as other forms of science, but clearly it's not, right? Clearly on his view, it's all about judgments. So he says that psychiatrists should stop pretending to be value-free, that if they want to continue, they have to admit their biases, right? Admit their certain predispositions right out the bat. Oh, he thinks the cancer scan is fine, but not psychiatric diagnosis. Does that make sense? We'll see. What I want to say is that, so Saz thinks the cancer scan is more objective than a psychiatric diagnosis. So I'm pointing that out. And at the same time, in my sneaky way, I tried to point out that there's still room for bias, discrimination, and judgments in and around the cancer scan, right? If somebody comes and asks you, and do you believe them that they need a scan? That's a place where bias can enter into medicine, right? Or if somebody has a scan, you get the scan, but then you go and you say, well, you shouldn't be in this much pain. I don't get it. That's also a place where the values come in. Good, yeah. So Saz thinks, right, that psychiatry is filled with these kinds of values, even in the act of diagnosis. And he says that belief in mental illness as an entity operates as a social tranquilizer to keep us, right, believing that what we have are individual problems, that what we have are brain problems. And for Saz, he doesn't develop a deep treatment. He thinks there is no cure per se because mental illnesses are not diseases, right? He says we should encourage and build people's personal responsibility, their freedom, and we should have community solutions instead of psychiatric ones. So this, as I said, it is a lot of new information, but hopefully it will be echoing through your mind as you read the Saz paper this week. So it's very controversial, right? Saz was controversial among other psychiatrists at his time, and positions like this, even if they accept things like medication or therapy, are still fairly marginalized, right? It's still maybe the most popular moment for these views was the 60s and 70s, and you'll get a lot of pushback against it today. So, yeah, wanted to let you know the asynchronous activities for this week. So there's the 6-page SAS piece on the myth of mental illness that I just gave you all the skeleton for. And there's a 28-minute debate between Thomas Szasz and another psychiatrist. So there is some discussion of suicide in the last 8 minutes. And this debate is on involuntary hospitalization. And then, as I said, there's a short reading questionnaire, which is just asking you to provide me with parts of the Szasz reading that you found helpful, clear, or unhelpful and confusing. You also have another assignment. So I did notice that there's quite a few of you who had not submitted the assignment last week. If you think that you may have a good reason for an accommodation, or if you're registered with the Access Center, please get in touch. We may be able to recover some of those marks. So the fourth response, I'm actually going to have you choose between the reading for this week and the video for this week. So the video is actually a debate between the two psychiatrists. And if you choose to do the video, let me pull up the document. If you choose to do the video, you should, in fact, make reference to the debate overall, as well as what each of them think. So rather than focus on one author, because there's not one author, there's two psychiatrists debating, you should frame it in terms of the main point of the debate, the main issues in contention. So as before, it's going to be due at midnight next week. And
what do you mean by contention? What do you mean by contention?
By what?
Contention.
So the major points of contention are the points of disagreement. So what are the things that the two psychiatrists in the video are disagreeing about strongly? What are the things that they're agreeing about more? Should hopefully help. Okay, this is the other thing. I'm going to start doing this. It's really, really, really hard to grade papers that are not double spaced, especially when you submit it in PDF, because then I can't change the spacing at all. So if your paper is not double spaced and does not include your name on the page, by on the page, I mean like right here, I will reply with a comment on Leia asking you to upload a new version. And I'm just not going to mark it until those two formatting changes are made. So I haven't been a stickler about these so far. But it is going to mean that I can mark more quickly and easily with these here. So I don't have to go back to the file folder to find your name to enter in my spreadsheet. And so I don't have to cram my comments into the side of the text. Otherwise, everything for the assignment is the same. So I raised it to 500 words for the last one. It's going to stay there. You can go a little bit over, you can go up to 100 over without me penalizing you. And I put this in the response as just a reminder. It is better to discuss one of your responses in depth than to discuss several in a shallow manner. So if you want to say, this reading reminded me of Batman, but also it caused me to see the world differently because I'm a lot nicer to cyclists. But also I was confused about the last line. It doesn't come across clearly, right? What your response is and how it relates. So it's a lot better to just focus on one strong feeling, one strong response, one strong thought. And don't forget that you can go and look at the writing workshop video to check it out if you want to revise and figure out the best way to get a higher grade. So are there any more questions about the assignment, about the asynchronous material?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. My internet was lagging. It's for when?
So it's for next week.
Okay, so next class?
Next week at 11:59 p.m. So after class.
Okay, perfect. And it's 500 words. So all the instructions are on Leia, right?
Yeah. I uploaded the instruction document on Leia. Let me see if I can show you.
Yeah, can you show me, please? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh shoot. This is where I'm like, oh my God. I thought it was recording. Oh, you know what happened? Oh my God, sorry. You know, I just realized that it was not recording because I had started it recording before I was having those silly microphone problems. Okay. So I know that there were a couple people who had to miss it. Oh, sorry. Let me go back before I email that person. So Leia's here. Shoot. Yeah, very sorry about the recording. My God. Is this us? Yeah, Monday assignments. So yeah, response number 4. So if you go to assignments in Dropbox, response number 4. And there's the instructions. Yeah. So if you can't find them in Leia, you can just send me a Mayo and I will attach it to there for you.
You need some documents, right? Or no?
Sorry?
Do we need some documents, like in the document section?
Yeah. So in this week, which is week 9, you have the link to the reading and you have the link to the video.
So both of them are for the assignment?
Yeah, you choose one. Don't write on both.
Yeah, we choose one and then we write the essay on one of them.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I had one person who had to miss class tonight and was wondering if anyone would be willing to share notes with them. If anybody's willing to do this, you can give me a shout in chat or send me a Mayo. Okay, shoot, I can't believe I forgot to record. Well, it was the speaker issue. But I will stay on here for a couple more minutes if anyone has questions. Please let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week.